Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here and to be able to share some of my ideas that I'm thinking about these days, which are on whether museums can really preserve our stories, not just our objects. There are many complex debates which are linked to questions around repatriation, which is being seen as a means to redress the political violence of the past. Each context actually makes us judge issues of current ownership differently. So many different art historians and museum curators would have come to you with different case studies, for instance, in this conference. There are many questions which emerge. In a repatriation claim, does the war booty, and we're in the middle of a war right now, belong to the usurper, or does the war booty belong to the vanquished? Or is it going to belong to the knight in shining armor, which is the country that comes out to help the other country which is under attack, which might take all the objects from that country under the pretext of saving those objects? So the rescue mission comes back into our current parlance. There's another question that comes into my mind. How far back in time can we go with provenance studies, and what is the right thing to do once we know the history of the object? Can we bring cases of historical wrongs of 4 or 5 generations to bear on our current decision making? Perhaps because it's still current in our minds and it is urgent. But can things that were done 20 generations ago or more still be brought to a court of law today? Is that still valid? Is there some time limit to this? Or can we go back to saying that we came from Africa and everything belongs to Africa? I mean, how far back do we go with repatriation claims? Because at some point, the deracinated or the uprooted person also becomes a naturalized citizen somewhere else. The uprooted object finds a new home and it lives on in a new context. The responsibility for the maintenance of a site and a material artifact has often been undertaken by a community which is quite different from the one that lost the object. And that maintenance may be taking place now in a manner that is perhaps different from how that object was meant to work. The context in which it was meant to survive is no longer there. So can we be so impervious to change that the new home and context can be completely disregarded? What really does depriving current owners of an object really achieve? Does it actually bring a museum visiting, a conservation, a museum maintaining habit to the country to which the object has been repatriated? I'm asking deliberately provocative questions to begin my talk because I want to be able to prise open some of these conversations to see how difficult it is to be able to come up with policies in the field of museum studies. While the decolonizing of museums may have been an urgent requirement, maybe 40 years ago, I think it's offering us too little too late now. It's become a very fashionable phrase. But I think for those of us who are living in the so-called developing world, I think what we are confronted with is different imperatives. And I don't think decolonization, the narrative of decolonization, can fix those problems. In the past few years, demands for restitution or repatriation have started intensifying, really speaking because of the delay in admitting this narrative of decolonization in Western museums. The demand for decolonization is not a new one. This thing about stolen objects, why are we waking up to it now, so late? So late. In 2022, we are having a conference on stolen objects. I mean, we should have been discussing this conversation 70 years ago when the British were withdrawing from Hong Kong, when the British were withdrawing from their colonial possessions and from everywhere else, and the empire was shrinking and India was getting its independence. But 75 years later, we're finally having a conversation about decolonization. Actually, I'm being a bit harsh. This conversation did start 100 years ago. And it did come to a crescendo, in fact, at the moment of independence for India, about 75 years ago. But nothing was done in Western museums and in Western textbooks to start talking about decolonization at that time. The demand lay latent. Why did this demand lie latent, and why was nothing done about it for so many years? Well, that's a separate conversation. Let's not get into that at the moment. But it's been an issue, and there's been correspondence on it. There are government files on this matter that one has looked at. The fact that few paid attention to the years of lobbying with education departments and museums to try and admit to a more conscionable narrative of colonialism and provenance research in their textbooks and in their displays is something that we must take note of. However, in 2020, the Black Lives Matter finally brought long-standing histories of racial and colonial violence into sharper focus with the destruction of public statuary in some places, and even the creation of new statues to replace those where colonizers stood in some other places. If provenance histories of many objects and the biographies of the collectors had been openly talked about for the past 70 years, perhaps the honest rationale for the Western Museum to continue to act as a custodian of objects that told complex stories may have been justified. Perhaps this destruction of objects could have been avoided. So much from the Indian side. But from the other side, as a European, this delay in talking about colonialism publicly has cost European publics their sense of selfhood as well. A number of writers and commentators have talked about that had there been a longer decolonizing narrative, especially in the UK, we might have been able to avoid a situation of Brexit. This is a narrative that could have done much to reduce British national chauvinism and admit multicultural societies into Western institutions had it been actively worked on for the past 75 years. The delay in doing so has led to vitriolic public demonstrations in Black Lives Matter and separatism in the West. But worst of all, it has left substantial populations alienated from their museums. Now, however, in an age of hyper-nationalism, we have to ask another really complicated question about what really is the driving desire for repatriation for countries like India. I mean, whose benefit is the narrative or propaganda of restitution now serving? The narrative accompanying Indian sculptures is one of restitution of a sacred object to the country to which it once belonged, even if that object is no longer capable of being brought back into worship. In times when religion is being used to bolster nationalism, the return of a historical artifact serves a very different propaganda rather than communicate rich and diverse history. So, is the Black Lives Matter movement actually being mobilized to foster nationalism and to foster a different kind of propaganda? And that's not really the intention with which it was started, but is that what it's going to be instrumentalized and used for? Repatriation can bolster India's national pride today as a reaction to how possession of objects from diverse parts of the world once encouraged colonial pride and empire building in Europe and Britain. Some have argued that in the UK, public institutions and school curricula could have done more to stem the rising national chauvinism in the past 2 decades, much of which has been associated with nostalgia for the lost British Empire. Large proportions of the citizens of the West have roots in countries that were formerly colonized, whose histories of how they came to be uprooted or why the objects of their previous countries are now in European collections are seldom told in public institutions. As I was saying, the delay in a decolonizing narrative has cost Western institutions by alienating their public. So the decolonization narrative is not just there for India's benefit anymore, but one that the US, Britain, and European countries need for maintaining their own cosmopolitanism. In India, decolonization may have been an issue that was important from the 1930s until the 1970s for righting colonial wrongs, but there are now many other more pressing matters that affect Indian art in terms of what markets and museums need by understanding better what museums can enable and how they need to be protected. Colonial wrongs and inequities may remain, but issues around violence perpetrated on the basis of caste or violence on the basis of religion and gender, the issues of climate, biodiversity, individual rights, and the right to knowledge, the freedom to speak, are pressing concerns in India, which can't really all be addressed through a narrative of decolonization or through the narrative of stolen objects or through the narrative of repatriation. It can't be this one-stop fix all ails. It can't fix all our problems. There are other issues that India itself has to take responsibility for after 75 years of independence. So can we continue to hang our peg our problems on the colonialism narrative still? We were presented with a fantastic opportunity when I was invited to co-curate an exhibition called India and the World, which was held first at the CSMVS Museum in Mumbai, and then later at the National Museum in Delhi. The exhibition was a collaboration with the British Museum and was the main exhibition to mark 70 years of Indian independence, with the involvement of the governments of both these countries. It was an opportunity for the Indian public to be able to see something they would otherwise never have known, never had the opportunity to see, because the British Museum decided to lend to India 100 artifacts from its treasures. Now, it was a great opportunity. What we did was we paired these objects with, each object was put into a strategic dialogue with an object from an Indian collection to be able to create dialogues between world cultures. It was an opportunity, as I said, for the Indian public to see something that they would otherwise never have got the exposure to see had they been able to go to Bloomsbury to be able to see it. But above all, it offered India a challenge to display things in the way they are displayed in Western museums, to have the same kind of security measures as you do in international museums, to be able to have exhibition spaces and provisions to take care of objects. What was shown through this was that a collaboration demands that we improve our level of expertise. Otherwise, our collaborator will withdraw their assets from the joint venture. Interestingly, this pushed the CSMVS in Mumbai to improve their capacities in all respects. And the museum has amply shown how a public-private partnership and joint venture enterprise is really the best safeguard for the collection and the fastest route to progress. Now, regrettably, the National Museum of India showed unpreparedness for this endeavor, and the press reported that as many as 12 objects had to be withdrawn, and several were sent back to the British Museum because of the lack of adequate facilities or skill in ensuring their safety in India. This lack of attention by the government of India will not inspire confidence in those who wish to repatriate objects. Yet, even as colonized countries need to get their own house in order, without addressing decolonization in Western education and museums, a wound is left open, and a ground for equitable knowledge sharing cannot be achieved. So we have to at least be able to talk about colonialism, and the requirement for decolonization can then start. The need for a narrative that attends to decolonization has become an urgent public requirement over many years now. No one can really prevent the telling of a history from colonization alongside objects that came from colonized nations anymore. There is also, at the same time, the very real requirement of the many diasporas of colonized communities who are now living in colonizing countries, who may well have claims to use the objects to be integrated in the narratives of the countries that they now call their home. So we have to balance both things. Decolonization does not immediately mean repatriation. Decolonization means talking about a decolonizing narrative. It means trying to be able to do sharing that knowledge and the knowledge production equitably. That would be true decolonization. The responsibility for looking after an asset is a responsibility. And we have to see who is really prepared to look after that asset. Our current global politics have seen a rise of hypernationalism. Questions equally have to be asked now that if the narrative of repatriation is being exploited for the sake of this hypernationalism. For instance, do we know of any examples in the past 10 years in the case of Indian art where the repatriation of Indo-Islamic artworks is also being fought for? Or is the restoration of India's national glory pegged largely to the restitution of India's Hindu culture? Now, this is extremely important because Black Lives Matter and decolonization narratives are otherwise going to be instrumentalized in the service of certain agendas that they had not envisaged. My critiques of the limitations and even the counterproductive nature of the 1972 UNESCO regulation, which prohibits the illegal trafficking of antiquities, have been published widely. And what I've tried to do in those publications is bring to attention the very systemic and real problems that are faced by poor countries like India. We may be asset rich, but these are source countries which are poor and don't have a really. So this brings me to the issue about the rights over artifacts as well, because we're confronted in our times with another parallel development, which is that can that nation state, which refugees or diasporic communities have run away from, which they have fled, today make a rightful claim to the artifacts of that country? For instance, if there were a Russian takeover of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine left, will the Russian Federation be the rightful person to seek for the repatriation of Ukrainian objects for the museum in Kiev? The same situation is there for Tibet. Is the government of China the rightful claimant for the objects that are being repatriated, which are Tibetan artifacts? We're faced with this dilemma all the time. Does the savior or does the new nation state become the rightful claimant, or is the person the rightful claimant? And if it is the person, then the person is mobile. And if the person is mobile, that person may now be a national of some other country. And so will that country then have the right to claim that object? What I'm trying to get at is that it is people that need to be accountable, not just the state. Machinery of the state has been known to be negligent or partisan. The negligence of artifacts in India is common knowledge and talked about in the press in India on a sort of monthly basis. The partisan favoring of certain types of artifacts and the negligence of others is also common knowledge. Sometimes a state itself ceases to exist, and then ascertaining ownership of artifacts becomes problematic. So prime examples are, for instance, the heritage of Chhattisgarh, which lie in its former capital, Bhopal, which is now only the capital of a state called Madhya Pradesh. Yet it owns the artifacts of Chhattisgarh. Bangladesh was once part of Pakistan, and there are lots of Bangladeshi objects that lie in the Museum of Karachi, because that used to be the National Museum of the United Pakistan. But it's not like that anymore. The division of material between states warrants scrutiny. The most glaring example of the injustices to heritage because of the seizing of state boundaries has been the case of Tibet. Tibetan objects have not been recognized by the government of China until very recently. Their refugees have taken out whatever they could to establish their culture in whichever land they have now settled in. Refugees and nomads carry their wealth, their objects on their person. And they don't have a sense of ownership of land or even a sense of nationalism. But our laws at the moment privilege the nation as being the spokesperson for all artifacts that fall within it. Diasporas and refugees are a very significant reality of the 20th and 21st century. Huge populations of Indian migrants live in different parts of the world who want to have collections of Indian art and want it in museums of the countries they now live in, where they hope to educate their children in their cultural histories. Insurgencies and refugees within South Asia necessitate other solutions. For instance, Hindus from Afghanistan and Pakistan have brought artifacts which could technically be claimed by those governments when they migrated to India. But I don't think the government of India is going to give those objects back to Afghanistan or to Pakistan today. Nor do I think Pakistan or Afghanistan want those objects back, actually. Well, back is a funny word. They may not have a claim to it at all. Tamil refugees from Sri Lanka, the discovery of a large number of Chola-style bronzes from Sri Lanka, vast numbers of sculptures from Bangladesh. I mean, these are all important case studies that compel us to have a more open policy for allowing communities to hold on to the artifacts they wish to within South Asia, irrespective of the changing national boundaries that they now find themselves in. I think one of the other issues that I want to talk about is the fact that the biggest perpetrator of the loss of heritage at the moment is not actually theft or looting, but there are these kinds of issues like migration or urban development. There are metros being constructed all over India for the past 15 years. You know, there's a metro that is being dug really just near where I am, just near my studio. I'm near the Qutub Minar, one of the most historic places in the whole of Asia. There are monuments around me that go back to the 7th century and carry on construction all the way till the 14th to the 20th. A metro line was made right here, and apparently no artifacts were discovered. Is that even possible? It's just that they're not being reported. A metro was constructed in Delhi under Chandni Chowk, the historic Mughal capital of Delhi. 3 columns or 4 arches or something is all they reported, apparently. Is that even possible? All over the world, you enter European metro stations where you've got stratigraphy. You've got metro construction was used as an opportunity for an excavation, not to stop the development, but to be able to talk about the history of that neighborhood. These things were put on display, but these opportunities were not seized over here. These opportunities were not taken. I'm not saying stop the development, but I'm just saying start recognizing the art history. So if you want to make so much of a case for stolen objects, let's actually start putting our house in order so that we can house those stolen objects. Let's actually start demonstrating that there are things we need to do. And let's build the capacities and let's share that knowledge and hold those countries that can share the wealth to improve the situation in India, to be able to collaborate with them and do things. That, I think, would be a more mobilizing, decolonizing narrative. India has 2 laws which went into the shaping of the 1972 UNESCO Convention. India, in fact, was at the forefront of pushing UNESCO into creating the 1972 Act, which we all know about, and played a very big role in the creation of the actual logistics and detail. Before the law was implemented by UNESCO, India had already drafted one which was on very similar lines, and that was ratified and brought into in about 1972. The guiding tenets of the Antiquities and Art Treasures Act sets out that this is an act to regulate the export trade in antiquities and art treasures, to prevent the smuggling of and fraudulent dealing in antiquities, to provide for the compulsory acquisition of antiquities for preservation in a public space. So it gives the state overarching power over anything that's more than 100 years old. Now, that means that things that were made in 1922 are antiquities. For a culture like India, where we find objects that go back to 3000 BC, and the amount of objects that are found, the quantity, is as vast as it is, to have a file and a registered status with the government for every single artifact that was made up until 1922. Remember, there's a changing definition today for what we consider an artifact. When these laws were first created, they were only meant to cover paintings or temples or sculptures. But today, with visual culture and anthropology, everything is regarded as being civilizationally important. Printed books, photographs, tickets. What will you leave out? It's a marker of civilization from 1922. My grandfather's watch. It's important. It tells us about the state of technology at that time. It has to therefore be registered, technically speaking, because that's the way the law is. I think the laws have outlived their purpose. They urgently need to be redrafted. And that drive to rewrite these laws has to come from UNESCO. And the reason for this is that the laws have completely outlived their purpose and they've become impracticable. They no longer keep pace with current globalization, with the current migration politics, the nature of cosmopolitanism, and the nature of public-private partnership. This is based on a model where the state has to take ownership of everything and has to therefore have the resources to be able to take care of everything, which the state has demonstrated that it is incapable of. And today, the state of India is asking the private sector to set up more and more museums, yet it is making it difficult for the private citizens of India to own more and more of these objects. So how then will the public institutions that the state wants the private sector to create emerge? There are conceptual problems that we are confronted with these regulations. So enlightened citizens in India have been trying to lobby and trying to have these laws changed for the past, I think, about 30 odd years. And they haven't really met with much success because Parliament never seems to have the time to discuss matters of culture like this and change and attend to laws and changing laws that affect the museum sector and the culture sector. It's very low in the priorities of the government. But whenever one has had opportunity to be able to work with the bureaucracy on this, one comes up with certain arguments that one listens to. The state has a misguided fear of the private sector, and especially in the field of heritage, even though we hear of fantastic public-private partnerships, there is a certain public perception which is allowed to be misguided because there is no investment in building a narrative that could act as a corrective. Popular books are published which talk about the gods being stolen. I mean, stolen is a really rabble-rousing phrase, but there are no popular books or TV programs or Facebook talks like this that counter that narrative, which talk about deconsecration, which talk about how ritually Hindus take objects every year and throw them away. We cast away material artifacts. Buddhists make beautiful objects which they put down in gardens, in forests, not to hold on to in their homes and not for museumification, but because the living culture itself believes in discard, believes in dematerialization. Where are the narratives about not holding on to materiality? There are too few museums in India that communicate to the public in their own vernacular languages, that are kept and maintained to the highest aesthetic standard, that communities can use as places of pride to take visitors to tell visitors something about themselves. Without community investment and private ownership of museums and artifacts, there can be no correction in the continuity of the state's overarching control or the license Raj that surrounds artifacts in India. We seem to be petrified of the art market and private collection in India. Private collectors are blamed with destroying sites, but actually the biggest destruction of sites has happened because of the government's development projects, because of population pressure, because of building metros and dams. Private collectors are actually indispensable. It was because of their farsightedness and enlightened measures that some of the most important museums of India and galleries have been created. They bequeathed their collections to the nation, which now enhances the glory of the government and in fact even creates the misconception that the government is the finder and creator of the collections and the knowledge, which it is not. It is simply the temporary caretaker of. Time and again, right from the days of the rescuing of the Amravati sculptures in the 19th century, the Indian Public Works Department or the Archaeological Survey of India have had a long history of having to work with private individuals or private societies to protect and salvage artifacts that the government machinery was not speedy enough in protecting. Without opening up a free and transparent domestic market, and without entering into a series of joint ventures for exhibitions and museum making, the whole arena of art and the protection of our heritage will remain jeopardized. So coming back to the narratives we need to tell. Now, coming back to my job as a curator, the backlash that Western museums face periodically brings them infamy on account of changing social perceptions. I think this is a paradox. The courage to bring these narratives forward and to talk about this infamous narrative keeps the museum at the vanguard of shaping knowledge. So the starting point for me as a curator then has been an acknowledgement that museums find themselves in this double bind. How will they protect the voices that bring them infamy? Did I say that right? How will they protect the voices that bring them infamy? Because even infamy is more acceptable than irrelevance. I wish to return to the subject of what is the nature of the narratives that we need to tell. Today, we are confronted more and more with inequities of gender, caste, environmental degradation, ruthless urbanization, and other burning issues that need attention in those countries which can't be addressed simply by decolonization or repatriation. Through my curatorial work and publications, I've tried, in whatever small way, to move the conversation beyond the ownership of an object to focus instead on the sharing of the knowledge and the capacity building of the countries that lack a vibrant museum sector. Using museums to tell narratives using their collections in the aftermath of colonialism about issues like climate change, majoritarianism, the closing of national borders, or inequities of caste and gender in times of extreme political conflict has become all the more pressing nowadays. The pandemic and our current planetary precarity on account of climate change has added much needed nuance and contradiction, forcing us to acknowledge our interdependence on each other, our need to take care of not just each other, but also our planet. Telling these narratives is urgent. But how will those narratives be told? And how will those narratives be protected in a digital age? Now, I think that's really the question going forward. I've been asked to try and talk about some of these issues and how I've tried to attend to them in my curatorial work. I don't think I can do that fully, to talk about all the ways in which I tried to address them, because everything is centered on the narrative each object tells. But I've tried to talk to you about what guided the nature of the narratives I've put forward. I attempted to look through a lens of visual culture, taking a more anthropological view of aesthetics. This particular exhibition on the body in Indian art was interestingly shown in precisely the same way without altering any of its labels and many of its texts for Indian audiences at the National Museum in Delhi and for Belgian or European audiences at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. This was important because otherwise I would have been a victim of self-ethnologizing or playing to an Orientalist bias. The exhibition was equally successful in both countries. The only major difference in both the iterations was that I insisted that the exhibition's narratives should be translated into local languages, that is, from English to French and Dutch in Brussels, and from English to Hindustani in India. And I learned a major lesson in this endeavor. The point I wish to make in not altering the narrative for the Indian and European audiences was to find a way to communicate the depth of available research on what we call ethnological into a subject or into a curriculum on global art history, which can be overwhelming normally for a Western public. And the museum establishment, as a result, is forced to fall back on presenting India or any other culture through older, very expected cliches of some exotic creature, some exotic culture, some other culture, some culture that is notable for its very fine Oriental hands that can make beautiful artifacts. But I wanted to move beyond it being only a culture that is rooted in religion and to locate that religion in changing history and in politics. India, as well as these many other cultures, which are non-Western cultures, find themselves stereotyped, forced to play a role circumscribed by the present agendas of history set up by the establishment, or merely performing a role of tokenism. Therefore, to have a narrative that was compelling to Indian audiences and as compelling to international audiences was a useful test to see what kinds of shifts in museum narratives can work today. It presented Indian art to the West without taking recourse to dividing it up in categories of Hindu art, Buddhist art, Islamic art. Instead, it looked at how religion was one of the variables that guides a society's celebration of its heroes, what qualities it values in its teachers, in its ascetics, how it elicits rapture, what it regards as death, the spirit, afterlife, how does it contend with birth and destiny, and finally, what does it regard as a spiritual or religious ideal or God, and what instruments does it use to promote that idea? I can't take you through all of the thematics, the new narratives, as I was saying, but my other exhibition, which was called India and the World, opened in this way in the CSMVS Museum, which had the famous Townley discobulus from the British Museum, surrounded by heroic sculptures circumambulating it in the rotunda, going around it clockwise, just as if he was throwing his discus counterclockwise, creating this movement between Indian heroes, Indian symbols of physical prowess, and a Western hero of physical prowess, radiating their energies in this circular space. Now, please note, given that objects that are valued by one community do not have the same significance in another community or in another society, the curatorial endeavor for displaying similar objects or like-for-like objects in talking about India and the world ran the risk of comparing apples and oranges. Yet, there is a parallel requirement, which is to promote harmony in a globalized world, to be able to see that we are all the same humans, all have the same concerns and expressions. We must somehow be able to see our commonalities. This was another double bind, because it's an enforcement of a narrative which could not be borne out easily. There were no objects from the same team, from all parts of the world, that were made at precisely the same time to be able to tell such a teleology. Audiences thus had to be presented with a demanding and disturbing display instead of counterpoints to the narrative of every gallery within each gallery, i.e., disturb the thematic within the thematic, within the subject of each gallery. We even went as far to having a final gallery to an exhibition that questioned the premise of the whole exhibition, right? A gallery that questioned the premise of making such a display, showcasing how we are different and how that difference should be respected and thus learnt to be lived with, becomes a more real way for the future when multiple perspectives will demand space. When I was asked to draft my concept note for this exhibition, I tried to alert my collaborators at the British Museum and in Indian museums that what history means or what traces epitomize a civilization can be very different in nature and can reveal very different priorities. I wrote at that time that at the very outset, it must be understood. This is my exhibition, opening of my exhibition concept note that was not on display, but it was in our internal meetings. It was discussed as the premise for the show. It must be understood that the intellectual basis for exhibitions on globalization or world art, thinking about art from the perspective of a universal museum, and indeed, even the larger enterprise of thinking about the discipline of history from a post-Enlightenment and post-Hegelian perspective, does not find easy acceptance or application in non-Western cultures. This exhibition needs to state, in simple terms, how it is choosing to define the term history and the term world art. We must recall that the mere act of historical chronological comparison may itself be perceived as a Western Hegelian way of approaching a subject. This approach is one that must be adopted with caveats. Different parts of the world view the very concept and idea of history and historical time differently. India has famously used ways to bring back memory and cyclical time in innovative ways, even as it has progressed through linear time. Such an appreciation would have to undergird any exhibition that seeks to examine India and the world through history. Now, why did I say that? Because history museums are reliant on timelines, on chronologies. And it doesn't exactly work like that. The same things were not important in both civilizations at the same time. And there are other discrepancies that come up at conceptual levels, which will cause problems in universal museums. difference, therefore, and a disturbance of the neatly packaged history of the world, as seen in 100 Objects in London, was, after all, inevitable when looked at from India and by Indians. A shift in focus does not come about only because of globalization and different nationalities coming to museums, but for many other reasons too: sexuality, language, social status, or now because of planetary precarity. While walking through a museum, we walk through a past that surrounds us with its testimonies as much of humankind's extraordinary progress as they are testimonies of its most depraved and sorrowful histories. Colonialism and subsequent globalization have ensured objects with different origins in time and space end up in museums and share the same temporal mode, a frozen and accidental synchronicity, the present disguised as a form of immortality bestowed uniquely by a museum. Everything is present simultaneously: the trophies, the colonized, the marginalized, the martyrs, and the prisoners, all speaking in what is often the house of the victor. Dead things that once had a life find articulation again. What was supposed to vanish is now forever present in a mode of being somewhere in limbo, in between, neither dead nor alive, thanks to a narrative provided to it with a distance of history. Eternity can then be achieved at the cost of being dead forever in a museum. What lives on through museums, then, are a variety of narratives, not just objects. The written or audiovisual communication intersperses the collection of objects like a binding glue, lending them relevance, as well as the opposite, where objects intersperse a historical narrative. The museum of our future will have to contend with the rising potential of these fragments of texts, oral testimonies, and the silences between those fragments. How will they be preserved? How will they be showcased? Technology now certainly permits the co-production of knowledge, but will ethics guard their protection? Or will they be blocked because of rights of ownership over the publishing or disseminating or transporting medium? Will co-produced histories and voices actually become the normative text, forcing a reckoning of both sides of an argument? Or is this just lip service? And will uncomfortable narratives continue to remain suppressed? A perspective of thinking about the museum and its narratives through the more ethical discipline of social design provides us with a methodological frame for approaching communication and media studies. It opens up a way to think about the language and images that have metaphors to transport or engage our public. Anyone who has access to the technology or to the medium of being able to put out a narrative can make a claim today to be heard. We're doing that today. However, as we have seen over the past decade, the trend is to drown out our little voices by those who own that technology or that platform or that medium to put out that narrative. So the effect of a dominant discourse can be hegemonic, it can be fascist, it can be seemingly convincing. And yet, with persistent regularity, there is the ever-present voice of those who dared to think of narratives that mattered to them personally. They shared them, they were followed, they were subscribed to by a number that was significant enough to constantly challenge the dominant narrative. So to survive the demands of this requirement for staying relevant to these many demanding voices that we are putting up, we will have to have institutions that are willing to back the narrators they rely on. Even when the narration is of a position that is contrary to the establishment, even when the establishment has to pay to have narratives that are critical of that establishment. As long as the basis of the narrative is based on research and serves the demands of an appreciable audience, The establishment cannot afford to become irrelevant. So it needs to pay attention to these narratives. These narratives make a case for shaping identities as much as objects did, and will demand their space in the museum, all right. But they also open another can of worms. Can our narratives be copyrighted? Can they be owned? The laws on sharing uploaded data have to be thought through in a globalized world. Can the medium for the expression of a narrative, owners of the online collections databases, or Wikipedia, Microsoft, or Google, and other tools and repositories, be made to repatriate to individual claimants? Can we seek redressal for our thefts of our narratives? Will old battles of repatriation set the basis for the claims for the capacity to showcase more recent history as well? Who will claims represent, or who will represent claims? A person governed by the laws implemented by their country? How sustainable are a country's claims to the ownership of certain narratives? The question of how decolonization has been dealt with, therefore, cannot be dismissed as being passé in this respect. The absence of dealing with this narrative head-on publicly has allowed the matter to fester, and the rioting protests in 2020 that have seen the tearing down of statues in public spaces, demands for the renaming of the cities named after slave traders and colonizers to make society see that Black Lives Matter is only symptomatic of the fact that narratives which needed to be widely disseminated decades back were not. Similarly, a sensible approach to allow for the safety of the objects in their collections, museums needed to do more with their narratives by which they came to own their objects, as well as the richer cultural histories that they can now enable. Without publicizing the standards of narrative and display afforded to them today, the museum allows itself to be questioned on its right to own the objects. At the risk of being repetitive, doing right by a collection has to be worth more than merely looking after it physically. A museum also has to reveal that the collection is relevant. Ownership, then, takes us not just to a matter of owning objects, but the claim made on owning the research and the narratives surrounding or enabled by those objects. The ownership of the physical object and the space to express its narratives may be under the care of one institution, which does not necessarily lend ownership of the creative agency and the labor and production of the varied narratives around it. This forces the museum to take care as much of the jobs of the narrator, researcher, curator, and writer as they do of the objects. In a time of planetary precarity, then, the very existence of museums is being called into question. We're also considering a very real possibility when objects will have to be locked away for safety because of all kinds of threats, political, social, climatic, because the threats are to the people who visit and work in those museums. History and heritage have to rely on being shared through means other than a physical means or through the real perusal of artifacts. The virtual, however, is ever more reliant on words, on writers, for it is the storylines that people search for in order to inform them of their objects that have to be protected. I'm trying to make a case that it is not just objects that are stolen, but even the stories that objects enable. Museums, therefore, must grow into institutions that preserve all these very many narratives as well. I've tried to bring a nuanced and a complicated picture to bear that it is not just a matter of the theft that we need to think of, but the practicalities in building the resources and building up the institutions to take cognizance of our realities in the 21st century, rather than peddle the same narrative that we've been asking for 75 years ago. I think we can't stay arrested simply with the repatriation question anymore. Thank you very much.